Hello and welcome to The Haunted Beard, everybody. My name is Jake. Thank you for joining me. Today, I have decided to bring to you my first ever iceberg video, and this one I think is going to be a little bit different. Most of the horror-related iceberg videos out there right now are covering the most disturbing movies or the scariest movie scenes, and I found one that I thought was a little bit different that I haven't seen anybody cover before, and that is the strange and obscure horror movie iceberg. This iceberg consists of 9 tiers, starting with some of the most popular and well-known horror films, and working all the way down to some of the strangest and, of course, most obscure movies, even down to films that have been lost. Today, I'm going to bring to you the first 3 tiers of this iceberg, and without further ado, let's do it. So, tier number 1 is You Watch Movies. These are some of the most classic and well-known horror films that even just general movie audiences would all be familiar with. But let's kick things off with The Shining, which was released in 1980, directed by Stanley Kubrick and starring Jack Nicholson and Shelley Duvall. This is a psychological horror film based on the novel by Stephen King. The film presents the descent into insanity of a recovering alcoholic and an aspiring novelist, Jack Torrance, played by Jack Nicholson, who takes a job as a winter caretaker for a haunted mountain resort hotel, the Overlook Hotel, with his wife, played by Shelley Duvall, and son, played by Danny Lloyd. And personally, this is one of my all-time favorite horror films, if not my absolute favorite. The Thing, released in 1982, directed by John Carpenter, starring the one and only Kurt Russell. A sci-fi horror classic based on the 1938 John W. Campbell Jr. novella, Who Goes There. It tells the story of a group of American researchers in Antarctica who encounter the eponymous Thing, an extraterrestrial life form that assimilates, then imitates other organisms. The group is overcome by paranoia and conflict as they learn that they can no longer trust each other and that any of them could be The Thing. Known for having quite possibly the best practical horror effects ever put to film, The Thing is another one of my all-time favorites, and I would say firmly plants itself inside my top 5 of all time. Friday the 13th, released in 1980, directed by Sean S. Cunningham, starring Betsy Palmer, Adrienne King, Harry Crosby, and a young Kevin Bacon. Prompted by the success of John Carpenter's Halloween, the plot follows a group of teenage camp counselors who are murdered one by one by an unknown killer while they are attempting to reopen the abandoned Camp Crystal Lake, a summer camp with a tragic past. Even though he isn't the killer in the first installment, this film introduced us to one of the most famous slasher killers of all time, Jason Voorhees. Ringu, released in 1998, directed by Hideo Nakata. This Japanese supernatural psychological horror film follows a reporter who is racing to investigate the mystery behind a cursed videotape. Whoever watches the tape dies 7 days after doing so. A classic in the J-horror subgenre, this film also led to an American remake from 2001, which is also widely beloved and many consider superior to the original Japanese film. Alien, released in 1979, directed by Ridley Scott, starring Sigourney Weaver, Tom Skerritt, and Ian Holm. Considered one of the most, if not the most, influential sci-fi horror film of all time, Alien follows a spaceship crew who investigates a derelict spaceship and are hunted by a deadly extraterrestrial creature. The film also introduced us to one of the greatest and most iconic horror creatures ever with the Xenomorph. The Exorcist, released in 1973, directed by William Friedkin, starring Ellen Burstyn, Max von Sydow, Jason Miller, and Linda Blair. This American supernatural horror film is based on the novel by William Peter Blatty. The film follows the demonic possession of a young girl named Reagan and the attempt to rescue her through an exorcism by 2 Catholic priests. The Exorcist was the first horror film ever to be nominated for Best Picture. And even today, this film is considered by many to be one of the scariest films ever made. Jaws, released in 1975, directed by Steven Spielberg, starring Roy Scheider, Richard Dreyfuss, and Robert Shaw. Based on the novel by Peter Benchley, Roy Scheider stars as police chief Martin Brody, who, with the help of a marine biologist, played by Dreyfuss, and a professional shark hunter, played by Shaw, hunts a man-eating great white shark that attacks beachgoers at the summer resort town. Jaws became the highest-grossing film of all time upon its release, and it officially launched the summer blockbuster film. Paranormal Activity, released in 2007, directed by Oren Peli, starring Katie Featherston and Micah Sloat. This American supernatural found-footage horror film centers on a young couple who are haunted by a supernatural presence inside their home. They then set up a camera to document what is haunting them while they're sleeping. Often considered the most profitable film ever made, Paranormal Activity was shot for $15,000 and grossed over $194 million worldwide. It also led to a resurgence in found footage films in the late aughts and into the 2010s. King Kong, released in 1933, directed by Marion C. Cooper and Ernest B. Schoedsack. The idea for the film came when Cooper decided he wanted to make a film about a giant gorilla struggling against modern civilization. The film follows a giant ape dubbed Kong who feels affection for a beautiful young woman played by Fay Wray. King Kong is well known for its groundbreaking use of special effects, such as stop-motion animation, matte painting, rear projection, and miniatures, all of which were conceived decades before the digital age. Godzilla, released in 1954, directed by Ishiro Honda, a Japanese epic kaiju film. In the film, Japan's authorities deal with the sudden appearance of a giant monster whose attacks trigger fears of nuclear holocaust in post-war Japan. The Silence of the Lambs, released in 1991, directed by Jonathan Demme, starring Anthony Hopkins, Jodie Foster, and Ted Levine. A psychological horror film adapted from Thomas Harris's novel of the same name. Foster plays Clarice Starling, a young FBI trainee who is hunting a serial killer named Buffalo Bill, played by Levine. To catch him, she seeks advice of the imprisoned Hannibal Lecter, played by Hopkins, a brilliant psychiatrist and cannibalistic serial killer. Hopkins' portrayal of Lecter gave us one of the most iconic movie villains of all time, and Silence of the Lambs still remains the first and only horror film to win Best Picture at the Academy Awards. A Nightmare on Elm Street, released in 1984, directed by Wes Craven, starring Heather Langenkamp and Robert Englund. This American supernatural slasher film concerns a group of teenagers who were targeted by Freddy Krueger, an undead child killer who murders teenagers through their dreams as retribution against their parents who burned him alive. The film is most well known for giving us another iconic slasher killer in Freddy Krueger, as well as one of the best final girls in Nancy, played by Langenkamp. The film also features one of my personal favorite horror movie kill scenes with Nancy's kill in the bedroom. Scream, released in 1996, also directed by Wes Craven, starring Neve Campbell, David Arquette, Courtney Cox, Matthew Lillard, Skeet Ulrich, and Drew Barrymore. An American slasher film set in the fictional town of Woodsboro, California, Scream's plot follows high school student Sydney Prescott and her friends, who on the anniversary of her mother's murder become targets of the costumed serial killer known as Ghostface. It's often credited for reigniting the horror genre in the 1990s, and its meta aspects and humor are what largely appealed to horror fans. Cloverfield, released in 2008, directed by Matt Reeves. An American found-footage monster horror film follows 6 young New York City residents fleeing from a massive monster and various other smaller creatures that attack the city during a farewell party. Nosferatu, released in 1922, directed by F.W. Murnau. A silent German expressionist vampire film and the unauthorized adaptation of Bram Stoker's Dracula, it stars Max Schreck as Count Orlok, a vampire who preys on the wife of his estate agent and brings the plague to their town. Dawn of the Dead, released in 1978, directed by George A. Romero. an American zombie horror classic. In the film, a phenomenon of unidentified origin has caused the reanimation of the dead, who prey on human flesh. David Emge, Ken Foree, Scott Reiniger, and Galen Ross star as survivors of the outbreak who barricade themselves inside a suburban shopping mall amid mass hysteria. The film is known for its social commentary, as Romero portrayed the zombies as a picture of American consumerism. Seven, released in 1995, directed by David Fincher, starring Brad Pitt and Morgan Freeman. This crime thriller, set in an unnamed crime-ridden city, Seven's narrative follows disenchanted, nearly retired Detective Lieutenant William Somerset, played by Freeman, and his newly transferred partner David Mills, played by Pitt, as they try to stop a serial killer from committing a series of murders based on the 7 deadly sins. Overall thoughts on Tier 1. I think this is a pretty good tier. I agree mostly with the picks. I would say that I think Cloverfield probably doesn't belong here on this top tier. It is a more well-known film, but certainly not one I would consider a classic, and I just don't think it really belongs with the other films on this tier. I think Cloverfield probably should have been on Tier 2, and there are a few films on Tier 2 that I think really rightfully belong on Tier 1. But let's kick off Tier 2. You watch horror movies. And starting out the second tier, we have Psycho, released in 1960, directed by Alfred Hitchcock, starring Anthony Perkins and Janet Leigh. The plot of Psycho centers on an encounter between an on-the-run embezzler, Marion Crane, and a shy motel proprietor, Norman Bates. Psycho is notorious for killing off its main protagonist roughly halfway through the film, in what is perhaps the most iconic scene in movie history. The Fly, released in 1986, directed by David Cronenberg, starring Jeff Goldblum and Geena Davis. An American sci-fi body horror film, tells of an eccentric scientist who, after one of his experiments goes wrong, slowly turns into a fly hybrid creature. Most well known for its horrifying body horror practical effects, showing the fleshy decomposition and transformation of lead character Seth Brundle, played by Goldblum. The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, released in 1920, directed by Robert Wiene. This silent film is quintessential work of early German expressionism cinema. It tells the story of an insane hypnotist who uses a brainwashed sleepwalker to commit murders. The film features a dark, twisted visual style. The script was inspired by the various personal experiences from the lives of the writers themselves, both pacifists who were left distrustful of authority after their experiences with the military during World War I. Frankenstein, released in 1931, directed by James Whale, starring Boris Karloff. Based on Mary Shelley's 1818 novel, the film follows an obsessed scientist who digs up corpses with his assistant in order to assemble a living being from the body parts. The Omen, released in 1973, directed by Richard Donner, starring Gregory Peck and Lee Remick. A supernatural horror film, the film's plot follows Damien Thorne, a young child replaced at birth by his father, unbeknownst to his wife after their biological child dies shortly after birth. As a series of mysterious events and violent deaths occur around the family and Damien enters childhood, they come to learn he is, in fact, the prophesied Antichrist. Suspiria, released in 1977, directed by Dario Argento, an Italian supernatural horror film. It stars Jessica Harper as an American ballet student who transfers to a prestigious European dance academy, but realizes after a series of murders that the academy is a front for a coven of witches. Well known for its use of beautiful, vibrant colors and musical score performed by progressive rock band Goblin. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, released in 1974, directed by Tobe Hooper. The plot follows a group of friends who fall victim to a family of cannibals while on their way to visit an old homestead. The film was marketed as being based on true events to attract a wider audience and to act as a subtle commentary on the era's political climate. Although the character of Leatherface and minor story details were inspired by the crimes of murderer Ed Gein, its plot is largely fictional. Halloween, released in 1978, directed by John Carpenter, starring Jamie Lee Curtis and Donald Pleasance. Another film on Tier 2 that I fully believe belongs on Tier 1. Halloween is not only considered by many to be the best slasher film ever made, It is also considered to have the greatest slasher killer of all time in Michael Myers. The film is set mostly in the fictional Illinois town of Haddonfield. The film follows mental patient Michael Myers, who is committed to a sanitarium for murdering his teenage sister one Halloween night during his childhood. He escapes 15 years later and returns to Haddonfield, where he stalks teenage babysitter Laurie Strode and her friends while his psychiatrist, Dr. Samuel Loomis, pursues him. The Hills Have Eyes, released in 1977, directed by Wes Craven. The film follows the Carters, a suburban family targeted by a family of cannibal savages after becoming stranded in the Nevada desert. Shot in the Mojave Desert, Craven based the film's script on the legend of Scottish cannibal Sawney Bean, which Craven viewed as illustrating how supposedly civilized people could become savage. Rosemary's Baby, released in 1968, directed by Roman Polanski, starring Mia Farrow, John Cassavetes, and Ruth Gordon. An American psychological horror film, Farrow plays a newlywed living in Manhattan who becomes pregnant, but soon begins to suspect that her neighbors have sinister intentions regarding her and her baby. The film deals with themes related to paranoia, women's liberation, Catholicism, and the occult. Saw, released in 2004, directed by James Wan, starring Cary Elwes, Lee Winnell, and Danny Glover. The film tells a non-linear narrative revolving around the mystery of the Jigsaw Killer, who tests his victims' will to live by putting them through deadly games, where they must inflict great physical pain upon themselves to survive. The frame story follows Jigsaw's latest victims, played by Winnell and Elwes, who awaken in a large, dilapidated bathroom, with one being ordered to kill the other to save his own family. The film launched one of the most successful horror franchises of all time and gave us another classic horror killer in Jigsaw, played by Tobin Bell. Creepshow, released in 1982, directed by George A. Romero. This is an American horror comedy anthology film written by Stephen King. Creepshow consists of 5 short stories, 2 of which were based on King's short stories themselves. Creepshow is an homage to the EC horror comics of the 1950s, such as Tales from the Crypt. The Evil Dead, released in 1981, directed by Sam Raimi, starring Bruce Campbell. The film follows 5 college students vacationing in an isolated cabin in the woods, where they find an audio tape that, when played, releases a legion of demons and spirits. 4 members of the group suffer from demonic possession, forcing the 5th member, Ash Williams, to survive an onslaught of increasingly gory mayhem. Hellraiser, released in 1987, directed by Clive Barker. A British supernatural horror film based on Barker's 1986 novella, The Hellbound Heart. The film's plot concerns a mystical puzzle box that summons the Cenobites, a group of extra-dimensional sadomasochistic beings who cannot differentiate between pain and pleasure. The film also gave us horror icon Pinhead, played by Doug Bradley. Braindead, released in 1992, directed by Peter Jackson. This is a New Zealand-produced zombie comedy splatter film. The plot follows Lionel, a young man living in South Wellington with his strict mother Vera. After Lionel becomes romantically entangled with a girl named Paquita, Vera is bitten by a hybrid rat-monkey creature and begins to transform into a zombie, while also infecting swaths of the city's populace. Widely considered one of the goriest films ever made, its climactic scene where Lionel uses a lawnmower to massacre a horde of zombies used over 79 gallons of fake blood. Tremors, released in 1990, directed by Ron Underwood, starring Kevin Bacon, Fred Ward, and Reba McEntire. An American monster horror film tells the story of handymen Val McKee and Earl Bassett, played by Bacon and Ward respectively, who wish to leave the small desert town of Perfection, Nevada, as they are tired of their dull lives. However, they happen upon a series of mysterious deaths. With the help of eccentric survivalist couple Bert and Heather, the group fights for survival against giant prehistoric worm-like monsters hungry for human flesh. Poltergeist, released in 1982, directed by Tobe Hooper, starring Craig T. Williams and Jo Beth Williams. Written by Steven Spielberg, the film focuses on a suburban family whose home is invaded by malevolent ghosts that abduct their youngest daughter through the TV screen. At a couple points throughout the iceberg, I noticed the creator just lists a collection of films either produced or directed by a particular person. Here we have Hammer Films. This is a British film production company based in London. Founded in 1934, the company is best known for a series of gothic horror and fantasy films made from the mid-1950s until the 1970s. Many of these involve classic horror characters such as Baron Victor Frankenstein, Count Dracula, and The Mummy. Hammer also produced science fiction, thrillers, film noir, and comedies, as well as, in later years, television series. Overall thoughts on Tier 2, like I said, I do think there are a few films that definitely belong on Tier 1, especially Halloween, Psycho, and probably the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. I also think you could make a case for something like Rosemary's Baby being on Tier 1 as well. That takes us to Tier 3, Horror Fan. And kicking off the third tier, we have Freaks, released in 1932, directed by Todd Browning. A circus's beautiful trapeze artist, Cleopatra, agrees to marry Hans, the leader of sideshow performers. But Hans's deformed friends discover that she is only marrying him for his inheritance, so they seek revenge. Darkman, released in 1990, directed by Sam Raimi. An American superhero horror film, the film stars Liam Neeson as scientist Peyton Westlake, who is brutally attacked, disfigured, and left for dead by ruthless mobster Robert Durant. An experimental treatment gives Westlake superhuman strength and resilience, with the unintended side effect of rendering him mentally unstable and borderline psychotic. Consumed with vengeance, Westlake continues his research with the new goal of hunting down those who disfigured him. Sleepy Hollow, released in 1999, directed by Tim Burton. This gothic supernatural horror film is a film adaptation loosely based on Washington Irving's 1820 short story, The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. It stars Johnny Depp and Christina Ricci. The plot follows police constable Ichabod Crane, sent from New York to investigate a series of murders in the village of Sleepy Hollow by a mysterious headless horseman. The Lawnmower Man, released in 1992, directed by Brett Leonard. A sci-fi horror film starring Jeff Fahey as Job Smith, an intellectually disabled gardener, and Pierce Brosnan as Dr. Larry Angelo, a scientist who decides to experiment on him in an effort to give him greater intelligence by stimulating his brain using drugs and virtual reality computer simulations. The experiments give Job superhuman abilities but also increase his aggression, turning him into a man obsessed with evolving into a digital being. The Devils, released in 1971, directed by Ken Russell. A historical psychological dramatic horror film, and also a dramatized historical account of the fall of Urbain Grandier, a 17th century Roman Catholic priest accused of witchcraft after the possessions in Loudun, France. The plot also focuses on Sister Jeanne d'Angus, a sexually repressed nun who incites the accusations. The film's graphic portrayal of violent and sexual content, often combined with religion, ignited harsh reaction from censors, and it originally received an X rating in both the UK and the United States. It was banned in several countries and heavily edited for exhibition in others. Cat People, released in 1942, directed by Jacques Tourneur. An American supernatural horror film tells the story of a newly married Serbian fashion illustrator obsessed with the idea that she is descended from an ancient tribe of cat people who metamorphosize into Black Panthers when aroused. When her husband begins to show interest in one of his co-workers, Irina begins to stalk her. Next entry, I was a little unclear on which film he was referring to specifically. There are two films titled Shallow Grave. Shallow Grave, released in 1987, directed by Richard Stiles. Its plot follows a group of young women traveling through the southern United States who are stalked by a psychotic sheriff after witnessing him commit a murder. However, I could hardly find anything about this film, and it only has 1,100 ratings on IMDb. Now, I know this is the strange and obscure horror iceberg. However, being on Tier 3, it seems like this film is even too obscure for Tier 3, considering what other films are represented on this tier. The other film, titled Shallow Grave, was released in 1994 and was directed by Danny Boyle. It stars Ewan McGregor and Christopher Eccleston. However, it is not a horror film, it is more of a dark comedic crime thriller. This one tells the story of three friends in Scotland who discover their new flatmate dead in his room. An ethical dilemma ensues when they discover that he possesses a large amount of cash. Things get worse as men whose money it was search for it, and the three friends start to turn on each other. Peeping Tom, released in 1960, directed by Michael Powell. The film revolves around a serial killer who murders women while using a portable film camera to record their dying expressions of terror, putting his footage together into a snuff film used for his own self-pleasure. Its title derives from the expression peeping Tom, which describes a voyeur. The film's controversial subject matter and its extremely harsh reception by critics had a severely negative impact on Powell's career as a director in the United Kingdom. However, it attracted a cult following, and in later years it has been reevaluated and is now widely considered a masterpiece and a progenitor of the contemporary slasher film. Eyes Without a Face, released in 1960, directed by Georges Franju. Based on a novel of the same name by French author Jean Redon, it revolves around a plastic surgeon who is determined to perform a face transplant on his daughter who is disfigured in a car accident. Roger Corman horror movies. Roger Corman was an American film director, producer, and actor. IMDb credits Corman with 55 directed films and some 385 produced films from 1954 through 2008. Near Dark, released in 1987, directed by Catherine Bigelow. A neo-Western horror film starring Adrian Pasdar, Jenny Wright, Bill Paxton, Lance Henriksen, and Jeanette Goldstein. The plot follows a young man in a small Oklahoma town who becomes involved with a family of nomadic American vampires. Originally performing poorly at the box office, it's since then become a cult classic. House of Frankenstein, released in 1944. This American horror film starring Boris Karloff, Lon Chaney Jr., and John Carradine. It's based on Kurt Siodmak's story, The Devil's Brood. The film is about Dr. Gustav Nierman, who escapes from prison and promises to create a new body for his assistant Daniel. Over the course of the film, they encounter Count Dracula, the Wolfman, and Frankenstein's monster. 9, released in 2009, directed by Shane Acker. A ragdoll that awakens in a post-apocalyptic future holds the key to humanity's salvation. Monster House, released in 2006. This American animated supernatural horror comedy film revolves around a neighborhood being terrorized by a sentient haunted house during Halloween. Maximum Overdrive, released in 1986, directed by Stephen King. King's only directorial effort, the screenplay was inspired by and loosely based on King's short story Trucks, which was included in the author's first collection of short stories, Night Shift. It follows the events after all machines, including trucks, radios, and arcade games, become sentient when Earth crosses the tail of a comet, initiating a worldwide killing spree. The Tenant, released in 1976, directed by Roman Polanski. A French psychological horror thriller film, a bureaucrat rents a Paris apartment where he finds himself drawn into a rabbit hole of dangerous paranoia. The Tenant is the final installment in Polanski's Apartment trilogy, following Repulsion in 1965 and Rosemary's Baby in 1968. And the final film closing out Tier 3 is Hazan, released in 1922. This Swedish-Danish silent horror essay film, written and directed by Benjamin Christensen, it consists partly of documentary-style storytelling as well as dramatized narrative sequences. The film purports to chart the historical roots and superstitions surrounding witchcraft beginning in the Middle Ages through the 20th century. It was based partly on Christensen's own study of the Malleus Maleficarum, a 15th century German guide for inquisitors. Hazan proposes that such witch hunts may have stemmed from misunderstandings of mental or neurological disorders triggering mass hysteria. Well, that concludes the first 3 tiers of the strange and obscure horror movie Iceberg. Thank you so much for joining me. If you got anything out of this video, go ahead and do me a favor and do not click that subscribe button unless you want to be haunted by the beard.